Did your parents ever hide you from your own life? I was 3 years old when the woman I called mom took me from a grocery store parking lot, but I wouldn't learn that for 13 years. What I knew growing up was that we didn't keep photos. There were no baby pictures of me anywhere in our house. Not one. Not a single blurry snapshot of a chubby toddler in a high chair. Nothing on the walls, nothing in a drawer, nothing on anyone's phone. When I asked, and I asked more than once when I was little, Mom said there'd been a fire before I could remember. A fire that took everything. All the albums, all the little home videos, every picture of me as a baby, and even the negatives. That's why we don't have any, she'd say, and her face would get tight and sad and go somewhere I couldn't follow. So I learned to stop asking, because asking hurt her, and I loved her, and I didn't want to be the reason she looked like that. Her name was Lorna, and she was the most careful person I have ever met in my life. She checked the locks 3 times every single night, front door, back door, the sliding door, in the same order, and if she got interrupted, she started over. She kept the blinds closed even in the middle of the day, so the house always had this dim, underwater feeling to it. She never once let me stand in the background of anyone else's photograph. If we were at a park and a family a few benches over started taking pictures of their own kids, she'd have me up and moving in a second, quick and quiet, one hand on my shoulder steering me out of frame, like the camera was a snake she'd seen in the grass. I thought that was just how mothers were. I had nothing to compare her to, because we didn't have other mothers around, we didn't have anybody around, so Lorna was my entire sample size for what normal looked like, and against that sample, nothing she did seemed strange. We moved constantly. I counted it up once later, and it was 11 towns before I turned 14. 11. All of them small. The kind of town with one stoplight and a gas station, and not much reason for a stranger to look twice at a new family. And all of them far apart, different states. Long drives through the dark, with everything we owned in the back of Hollis's van. Every time I started to make a friend, every time some kid on a cul-de-sac started knocking on our door to see if I could come out, we'd leave. Mom always said it was her job that made us move, that she got transferred, that they needed her somewhere new. But here is a thing I never once saw in 16 years. I never once saw Lorna leave the house to go to a job. Not once. Hollis, the man I called Dad, drove a delivery route and did all the packing and all the driving on moving days, and he never argued with Lorna about anything, ever, about where we went, or when, or why. He was quiet in a specific way that I understand now, but didn't then. The quiet of a man who is always holding his breath, always braced for a knock, and back then I just thought my dad was a shy man who liked to be left alone with his radio. We never had relatives, not one. No grandparents who sent cards, no cousins to compare ages with, no aunt who called on the holidays, nobody. Mom said both sides of the family had cut us off years ago before I was born, over something old and ugly that she would never explain, and that we were better off, safer, cleaner, without people like that in our lives. I didn't go to school, not a real one, not ever. Mom homeschooled me at the kitchen table because, she said, schools report everything about a child straight to the government, every name and birthday and address, and the government could not be trusted with children, and she said that last part with a weight that I felt but didn't understand. So while other kids my age got on yellow buses in the morning, I did workbooks alone, and I was actually pretty far ahead in reading because there was nothing else to do in a house with the blinds closed. But I was strange in every way that mattered, because I had no idea how to be a person around other people. I only ever saw a doctor twice in my whole childhood, both times for a broken bone, once an arm and once a couple of fingers, and both times Lorna drove us more than an hour to a walk-in clinic in a town we didn't live in, and both times she did every single bit of the talking and had me wait in the car while she filled out the forms, and both times we were back on the road before the cast was even fully dry. She kept my hair dyed dark from the time I was small enough to sit still with a towel around my shoulders. She said my natural color, a light reddish brown, was mousy, that it washed me out. That dark hair looked sharper on me, and she'd redo it in the bathroom every few weeks, the smell of the dye stinging my eyes, and I never once thought there was anything odd about a mother dyeing a little boy's hair, because it was just something we did, like checking the locks, like moving towns, like never smiling into a camera. This was my life, and I was Rook. That was my name, Rook. And Hollis and Lorna were my parents, and we kept to ourselves and stayed low and moved often, and if any part of me sensed the crookedness of it, that part didn't have any other house to measure ours against, except for the yellow kitchen. There was one memory I carried my whole life that did not fit anywhere in the story I'd been given, and I could never make it fit, no matter how I turned it. A kitchen with yellow walls and yellow curtains, sun pouring in so bright it was almost white, and a young woman with light hair standing at the counter singing something under her breath while she cut an apple into slices, and she was calling me a name, and the name was not Rook. In the memory, the name was soft, 2 syllables, and she said it the way you say a name you love, and I could almost hear it but never quite catch the whole shape of it. It slipped away every time like a word on the tip of your tongue. I used to dream about that kitchen so often that I thought everyone had a kitchen like it in their head. When I finally worked up the nerve to describe it to Lorna, I was maybe 9. She went very still at the sink, her back to me, and stayed still for a long moment, and then she turned around with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and told me it was from a movie, a cartoon I'd loved as a baby, before the fire. Fire, and that I'd always had trouble telling that movie apart from real memories. "You do that," she said, light and quick. "You always mix that movie up with real life. It's not real, baby." But here is the thing that I could never explain away, and the thing that kept the memory alive in me for years after I should have let it go. You can't smell things in a movie, and I could smell those apples. I could smell the sunlight on the counter and the green of those apple slices as clearly as I could smell anything in the room I was standing in, and no cartoon puts a smell in your nose 13 years later. Looking back, I can see now that every move was really an escape, that Lorna wasn't chasing a job. She was running from a moment where somebody got too close to seeing me clearly, and the whole strange rhythm of my childhood makes a terrible kind of sense once you understand that. There was the town we left because a new elementary school wanted my old school records before they'd enroll me, records that didn't exist, and Lorna decided that week that homeschooling was the only safe way, and we were gone before the paperwork could be pushed. There was the town we left because a neighbor, a friendly retired woman who liked me, kept asking gentle questions about where we'd come from, and whether I favored my mother or my father. And one evening I mentioned to Lorna that the neighbor had said I looked nothing like either of them, and we packed that same night. There was the pediatric nurse in some clinic in some town who frowned at the empty space on my chart where a birth history and a vaccination record should have been, who asked Lorna a few too many questions and a few too even a voice. And Lorna took me by the wrist and walked us straight out of the waiting room, and we never went back, and I had a fever for 3 more days. I didn't understand any of it then. I thought I had a nervous mother and a run of bad luck with towns. Lorna drilled me on what to say the way other parents drilled fire drills. If a grown-up asks you how old you are, you smile and you say you're shy and you come find me. If anyone asks where you were born, you say you don't really remember. You were little and you come find me. If a teacher or a coach or a stranger in a store asks your birthday, your real name, where your family's from, you go quiet and polite and you find me. She'd run me through it in the car, calm, like multiplication tables, and I got so good at the shy smile that I could feel it click onto my face on its own, and it took me years after everything to learn how to answer a simple question about myself without that old trapdoor of fear opening under me first. There were near misses I only recognized as near misses much later. A rest stop on one of the long night drives had a corkboard by the vending machines papered over with missing children flyers, those grids of faded faces and dates, and Lorna's whole body changed when she saw it, and she steered me past it with a hand flat on my back and bought me a candy bar I hadn't asked for to keep my eyes down. And I have wondered since whether one of those faded faces was one of Vesta Coyle's other children, or whether Lorna simply couldn't stand to stand near the board at all. There was a diner where a woman 2 booths over kept looking at me, just looking, the way you look when something is snagging at the edge of your memory, and Lorna left money on the table and hurried us out before our food came, and told me the woman had seemed unwell, and I believed her because I always believed her. The dye was a ritual I never questioned. Every few weeks, a towel around my shoulders, the sharp chemical smell, Lorna's fingers careful along my hairline, my natural reddish brown disappearing back under the dark, and once, when I was maybe 10, the roots came in faster than she expected before a move, and a checkout clerk said what a pretty color my hair was underneath, and Lorna's hand tightened on my shoulder, and we were at the drugstore buying a box before we even got home. There were no dentist visits, no team photos even the 2 seasons she let me play a sport, no yearbook, no field trips, nothing that would put my face on a list or in a file or in a stranger's camera, and under her bed there was a locked metal box I was never, ever to touch, and I never did. And I understand now that everything true about me lived inside it the whole time. The forged certificate, the dead boy's number, the newspaper clipping about a missing 3-year-old named Julian that she kept and read and kept, the proof that she had always known exactly what she'd done, folded up and locked away 4 feet beneath where she slept. And through all of it, underneath all of it, was the yellow kitchen. It came back to me at odd hours my whole childhood, the yellow walls and the sunlight and the woman with the light hair singing while she cut apple slices, calling me the soft 2-syllable name I could never quite catch, and every time I tried to tell Lorna about it, she would go still in that particular way and tell me it was a movie, that I confused a movie with my life, that it wasn't real, and I would let her convince me, except that I could always smell the apples, and you cannot smell things in a movie, and some quiet, stubborn part of me held on to that one detail across 13 years like a coin in a fist. I turned 12, and Lorna got stricter about everything, tighter. Like the older I got, the more of me there was to lose. No going anywhere alone, not even to the end of the block. No talking to neighbors, and if a neighbor talked to me, I was to be polite and brief and come straight inside. And she drilled me, actually drilled me like it was a fire escape plan, on what to do if anyone, an adult, another kid, anyone, asked me questions about myself. If someone asked my birthday, or where I was born, or how old I was, or what school I went to, or where we'd lived before, I was to smile and say I was shy and go find her. She made me practice it. She'd play the stranger, ask in a friendly voice when my birthday was, and if I hesitated or started to answer, she'd stop me and make me do it again until the deflection was automatic, until "I'm kind of shy, I'll go get my mom" came out of me faster than the truth ever could. People are nosy, she'd tell me, smoothing my dark hair down. It's not their business who we are. We keep our business ours. When I turned 14, she sat me down at the kitchen table one night, both hands flat on the wood, and told me that we were changing our last name. Just like that. A new last name, effective immediately. A new name on the mailbox. A whole fresh stack of paperwork that she kept in a locked gray metal box under her side of the bed. A box I'd seen 100 times and never once seen open. I asked her why. Of course I asked why. You don't just wake up with a different last name. And she told me the old name had bad memories attached to it. Memories connected to the family that had cut us off, and that she wanted a clean, fresh start for all three of us. A name with nothing heavy stuck to it. I remember lying awake that night thinking it was a strange thing, that you could shed a name like a coat whenever the old one got too heavy to carry. But I was 14, and she was my mother, and mothers do not lie to you about who you are. So I let the strangeness of it sink down under the surface with all the other strange things. The fire, the nameless family, the closed blinds, the yellow kitchen, and I went to sleep as a boy with a brand new last name, and did not let myself wonder too hard about the old one. Then I turned 16, and I wanted a driver's permit, and that is where the whole careful thing my mother had built around me finally cracked. Every kid I had ever briefly known, in every town, talked about the driver's permit like it was the front door to the rest of your life, the first real thing that made you a person instead of a child, and I wanted it more than I'd wanted anything. So one evening I told Lorna I was ready to get my permit, and I watched something move across her face that I had never seen there in 16 years. And it wasn't the tight sadness from the fire questions, and it wasn't annoyance. It was fear, real fear, the kind that pulls the blood out of a person's face and leaves them gray. You don't need a permit, she said, and her voice was too even, too careful. I'll drive you anywhere you need to go, always. You know that. I said, everybody gets a permit, Mom. It's not a big deal. You just bring your birth certificate and your social security card to the office and you take the test. And at the words birth certificate and social security card, something happened behind her eyes, a door slamming, and she said we would talk about it later, and she got up and started checking the locks even though it was the middle of the afternoon. We never talked about it later. Every single time I raised it over the following weeks, she changed the subject so fast and so hard that it made my head spin, and after the fourth or fifth time, I stopped raising it out loud, but I did not stop thinking about it, because her fear had done something no lecture ever could have. It had told me that there was a real thing under all of this. That's when the small, wrong things I'd swallowed my whole life started climbing back up and stacking themselves into a pile I couldn't look away from. A fire that destroyed every photo, but that Lorna could not or would not tell me the year of, or the address of, or the name of a single thing we'd lost besides pictures. A family that had cut us off, but that had no names, no faces, no stories, just a cold wall she put up whenever I got close. A birth certificate she would not show me. A birth certificate she got visibly afraid at the mention of. 11 towns. A last name we'd worn for 2 years now that had replaced a last name she wouldn't say out loud. The way she flinched, actually flinched, when a stranger's eyes rested on me a beat too long, something I had never consciously noticed until I was 16 and starting to see my mother as a person instead of just the sky over my life. The dark dye over the reddish brown that grew in at my roots every 3 weeks. And under all of it, the yellow kitchen, and the smell of real apples, and a soft 2-syllable name that was not Rook. I started keeping a list. In the back of a math workbook, in small handwriting, just questions, just the things that didn't line up. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was being dramatic, that lots of families were private. But every week the list got a little longer, and I would lie in bed at night in whatever town we were in that month and feel like a person standing in a house where one single wall is built a fraction of a degree off true. You can't see it. Everything looks fine, but your body knows. Your body can feel that the whole structure is subtly, deeply crooked, and that one day, if enough weight is put in the wrong place, it is going to come down. The thing that finally brought it down was a cheek swab, and I almost didn't do it. I had exactly one real friend that year, a boy named Fitch, whose family ran the homeschool sports co-op that met in a church gym twice a week. The one and only social thing Lorna had never managed to find a reason to forbid, because it was Christian and small and full of families she considered safe, and because I begged, and because even she could see that a 16-year-old who had never had a friend was becoming a strange and brittle thing. Fitch was loud and easy, and he never once asked me the kinds of questions I'd been drilled to deflect. He just accepted that I was the private homeschool kid whose family moved a lot, and he folded me into his life without making me explain any of mine. Over the holidays that year, Fitch's parents had bought a big multi-pack of those DNA ancestry kits, the kind where you swab your cheek or spit in a little tube and mail it off, and 6 weeks later a website tells you you're 19% Scandinavian and gives you a map with your ancestors' migration routes on it. His whole family did them at the kitchen table one weekend for fun, and there was an extra kit, and Fitch thought it would be funny for the two of us to do it and compare, see whose blood came from somewhere more interesting. I almost said no. I want you to understand that I almost said no, that some old instinct I had absorbed from Lorna without ever knowing I'd absorbed it, some deep quiet alarm that lived in my chest, told me clearly not to put my body into a database, not to make myself findable, not to answer the question of who I was with something as permanent as DNA. But I was 16 and I was standing in a warm, loud house that was full of photographs, walls of them, a family's whole documented life hung up for anyone to see, and I wanted, more than the alarm scared me, to know one single true thing about myself. So I went into Fitch's bathroom and I swabbed the inside of my cheek and I sealed the little tube, and Fitch mailed it off with his family's the next day, and I did not tell Lorna, and I told myself it was nothing, it was a game, it was just going to tell me what country I was from. The moment the tube was sealed and dropped in the mail with the rest of Fitch's family's kits, the old alarm in my chest started ringing and did not stop for 6 weeks. I had done the one thing Lorna had spent my whole life training me never to do. I had made myself findable. I had answered the question of who I was with something permanent, and I could not take it back. I nearly asked Fitch to cancel it a dozen times, hovered over saying it, and then swallowed it, because how do you explain that kind of dread to a loud, easy kid whose biggest secret is a crush? What saved me, though I didn't understand it as being saved at the time, was that the whole thing was tied to Fitch's family, their account, their email, their address, because Lorna controlled our mail the way she controlled everything, opened every envelope that came to our house, and if that kid had been registered to any address of ours, she would have known the day the results came in, and I would have vanished into a 12th town before the ink was dry. But it went to Fitch's, and Lorna never had any idea, and that accident of a friend's kitchen table is the thin thread the whole rest of my life hangs from. Those 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives at once, the ordinary one where I did my workbooks and dyed my roots and deflected Lorna's questions with the shy smile, and a secret one underneath where a laboratory somewhere was slowly, mechanically, taking my blood apart to tell me who I really was, and every day I told myself it would come back nothing, that I was being paranoid, that the alarm in my chest was just Lorna's fear that she'd installed in me and not anything true. I almost convinced myself. And then Fitch pulled me aside at the gym. 6 weeks later, Fitch pulled me off to the side of the gym after co-op, away from the other kids, and his face was pale and wrong. He said the Ancestry company had flagged something on my results, that there was a notice attached to my account that he didn't understand. So he'd shown it to his mother, and his mother had read it and gone very quiet and told him to put it directly into my hands and not to show it to anybody else and not to talk about it. He handed me a folded printout, and his hand was a little shaky, and he said he was sorry. He didn't know what it meant, and then he gave me space. The Ancestry service had a feature, an optional one, where if you turned it on, it would notify you when a close biological relative also took the test and matched your DNA, a way for people to find half-siblings and unknown fathers and lost cousins. My results had come back with one match, a woman, and the relationship estimate, in plain gray letters, said parent-child, and her last name was not Lorna's, and it was not Hollis's, and it was not the last name we'd worn for 2 years, and it was not the heavy old last name Lorna had shed and never spoken. It was a name I had never once heard in my entire life, and underneath her name there was a second line, a smaller automated line the company generated only for certain matches, and it said that this woman had submitted her DNA years earlier, not to find out she was Scandinavian, but to a national database maintained for the families of missing and abducted children. I read those words standing at the edge of a church gymnasium with kids shooting baskets 20 feet away, the families of missing children. I have to be honest with you, because this whole thing is worth nothing if I'm not, that for a full day after that, I did nothing at all. I was too frightened to become a person with a past. I folded the printout back up and I hid it inside the math workbook with my list of questions, tucked between 2 pages of long division, and I went home and I sat at dinner across from Lorna, the woman who checked the locks 3 times, who moved us 11 times, who burned no photographs in a fire that I now understood had almost certainly never happened, and I looked at her buttering a piece of bread, and I understood, in my body, long before my mind would let me say the words, that she was hiding me, not from the world, not from predators or the government or the nosy people she was always warning me about. She was hiding me from my own life. There was another version of me out there, a boy named something soft with 2 syllables, a boy from a yellow kitchen, and she had taken him and buried him under dark dye and a false last name and a story about a fire, and rebuilt him into a quiet, careful kid named Rook, who never smiled into cameras, and she had loved that kid. That was the part I could not hold. She had loved me the whole time. The next morning, I told Lorna I was going to Fitch's house to study, and instead I walked 2 miles to the public library, the one building in town with computers that Lorna did not control and could not see, and I sat down at a terminal in the corner with my back to the wall, and I typed the woman's name into the search bar, and my hands were shaking so badly that I made 3 typos before I got it right. The very first result was a news article, 13 years old. There was a photograph at the top of it, a young woman with light reddish-brown hair, my hair, the color that grew in at my roots every 3 weeks under the dye, and she was holding a toddler on her hip and laughing at whoever held the camera, and behind the 2 of them, out of focus but unmistakable, was a kitchen with yellow walls and yellow curtains. And the headline said that a 3-year-old boy had been taken from a grocery store parking lot in the middle of a bright afternoon, lifted right out of the seat of a shopping cart while his mother turned to load bags into the trunk, gone in under 90 seconds. No witnesses, no vehicle description, no trace. And the boy's name, the real name, the soft two-syllable name I had been hearing at the edge of my dreams for my entire life, was Julian. I was Julian. I sat in the corner of that library, and I looked at a photograph of a woman I could not remember holding a baby I could not remember being. Standing in a kitchen, I remembered more clearly than any room I had ever lived in, and the wall that had been built a fraction of a degree off true for 16 years, finally, quietly, completely came down. There was a phone number at the bottom of the article, a tip line, and against all odds it was still active 13 years later, because some cases stay open, because some people never stop looking. I did not call it from my own phone because even then, even in the middle of learning I was stolen, I was still the boy Lorna had trained, still afraid to attach my name to anything. I used the payphone outside the library, one of the last ones in the county, and a detective answered on the second ring. His name was Odell Frost, and he had worked missing children cases for 22 years, and I would learn later that the case of the 3-year-old taken from the grocery store parking lot was one of the ones he had never been able to close, one of the ones he kept a copy of at home, one of the ones that woke him at 3 in the morning. I told him, my voice barely working, that I thought I might be a boy who went missing a long time ago. He didn't laugh, he didn't tell me to slow down, he got very calm and very gentle, and he asked me a few small questions in a soft, steady voice, and I answered them one at a time. Dark hair that I dyed, a family that moved constantly, small towns, far apart, no photographs, a story about a fire, a memory of a yellow kitchen, and with every answer I gave, his voice got a little quieter and a little more careful, and after the yellow kitchen, there was a pause on the line where I could hear him breathing, and then he asked me, very steadily, where I was standing right now, and he told me not to go home, whatever I did, not to go home, and to stay exactly where I was, that he was already in his car, that he was already coming. I want to try to tell you what it is to sit on the curb outside a library and wait to find out whether your entire life has been a lie, but I don't think there are words that hold it. It is like drowning very slowly in the middle of a sunny afternoon while people walk past you carrying stacks of returned books, none of them knowing that the boy on the curb is coming apart. Those 40 minutes were the longest of my life, longer than the trials, longer than any single night of nightmares that came after, because in those 40 minutes, I was still 2 people at once and about to become only one. I kept the printout folded in my fist so tight my nails left marks in my palm. Every car that turned onto the street made my whole body seize, because any one of them could be Hollis's van, could be Lorna come looking because I'd been gone too long from a study session at Fitch's that Fitch didn't even know he was covering for, and I sat there and did the math over and over. How long since I'd left? How long before she'd call Fitch's mother? How long before the careful woman who checked the locks 3 times a night noticed the fraction of a degree that was off in her own? Careful world. Part of me, a large and terrified part, wanted to stand up and walk home and put the printout back inside the math workbook and let the wall go back up, because the wall was the only house I had ever lived in, and I understood in those 40 minutes something that I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't stolen, which is that finding out the truth did not feel like being rescued. It felt like a death, the death of Rook, the boy I had been for 13 years, the boy Lorna loved, and I was the only one who would ever grieve him, because to everyone else he was a crime, and to me he was just me. I thought about the yellow kitchen, and the woman singing, and the apples I could always smell, and I thought that if I stood up and went home, I would spend the rest of my life smelling those apples and being told they weren't real. And that was the thing, in the end, that kept me on the curb. Not courage. I wasn't brave. I just could not go back to being told that the one true thing I had ever held on to was a movie. So I stayed, and I shook, and I watched every car, and I waited to find out whose I was. 2 unmarked cars pulled up about 40 minutes later. Detective Frost got out of the first one before it had fully stopped. An older man, heavyset, with tired, kind eyes and gray in his mustache, and behind him came a woman in a windbreaker with FBI stenciled across the back, and 2 local officers in plain clothes. Frost came over to me slow, with his hands where I could see them, and then he crouched all the way down to my level on that curb, which no adult had done to me since I was very small, and he took a photograph out of a folder and held it up next to my face without touching me. It was an age-progressed image, a computer's best guess at what the missing 3-year-old would look like at 16, generated by his unit and updated over the years, and I looked at it, and it was not a guess. It was my face. It was just my face looking back at me. Frost looked from the photo to me and back again, and then he set the folder down on his knee, and he said very carefully, in that soft, flat voice, "Hi, Julian." And 13 years of a name that had never belonged to me cracked open all at once, and I started to cry in a way I had not known a person could cry, huge and silent and endless, my whole body shaking on that curb, because someone in the world had finally called me the name from the yellow kitchen out loud, and it was real. The apples were real. The singing was real. The woman with the light hair was real, and every other thing I had been told about who I was not. They did not take me back to the house. I understood later that this was deliberate and careful, that a recovered child is never returned to the scene, and instead they drove me to a police station where they put me in a quiet room that did not look like the rooms on television, and a woman with kind eyes named Prudence Hale came in and sat with me. She was a social worker who specialized in recovered and abducted children, and she had done this before, sat with kids on the worst and most disorienting day of their lives, and it showed in how she moved, slow and unhurried, getting me water, sitting where I could see her, never crowding me. She explained what was going to happen in small, simple pieces, over and over, as many times as I needed. I was going into protective custody. My biological family had been located and had already been notified. A cheek swab, a real one this time, an official one, would confirm what everyone in the building already knew from my face. She asked if I wanted to know about my real family, and I said yes and no in the same breath, and she nodded like both of those were exactly the right answer, because they were. Detective Frost came in after an hour and sat down across from me and told me the rest of it, the parts I had already begun to piece together in the library and could not yet make myself fully believe. Lorna was not my mother. 13 years ago, she had taken me, a 3-year-old boy named Julian, from a grocery store parking lot 900 miles from the town we were sitting in now. Hollis had not been present that day, had not been part of the taking, but had learned the truth within a month of it, and had chosen, every single day for 13 years after that, to help her hide me rather than pick up a phone. My biological mother's name was Marion, and Marion had never, in 13 years, stopped looking for me. She had put up billboards. She had done every interview any reporter would give her, on every anniversary for over a decade, holding up the age-progressed pictures, begging. She had submitted her DNA to the National Missing Children's Database 8 years ago, and then 2 years ago, on the advice of a support group for parents of the missing, she had also tested with the Commercial Ancestry Service, just in case, just on the chance, and that decision, that small, hopeful, desperate decision, was the only reason my swab had ever found her, and she had never moved. In 13 years, she had never once left the town I was taken from, and when a reporter had asked her why she didn't move somewhere with fewer memories, she had said, and Frost quoted it to me quietly, that she couldn't leave, because if her son ever found his way home, she needed to be there when he did. Frost told me all of this in his soft, flat voice, one piece at a time, and I sat there and could not get my mind to hold any of it, because I had spent 16 years believing I came from a fire and a fractured family and a mother who kept me safe. And the truth was that I had a mother who had spent 13 years refusing to let me become a memory, refusing to let the world file me away as gone, and I hadn't even known that I was lost. They arrested Lorna and Hollis that same night, at the house, at the kitchen table where I'd eaten dinner across from her the evening before. Frost made sure I knew before it happened, not the details, just that it was done, that they were both in custody, that they could not reach me and could not run. When the officers searched the house, they found the locked gray metal box under Lorna's side of the bed, the box I'd seen 100 times and never seen open, and they opened it, and inside it was a forged birth certificate for a child named Rook, printed on real stock with a real-looking seal, and a social security card in that name that had actually belonged to an infant who had died decades ago in another state entirely, a dead baby whose identity had been dug up and handed to me. And folded underneath all of it, soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded many times over many years, was a newspaper clipping about a 3-year-old boy named Julian, who had vanished from a grocery store parking lot. Lorna had kept it. For 13 years, she had kept the article about the child she had taken, which meant that there had never been a single day, not one, when she did not know exactly what she had done and exactly who I really was. And there was one more thing in that box that none of us saw coming, one small thing that would turn out to be the loose thread on the whole world, a ledger, a small black accounting book, half filled with a careful hand, and beside it, a cheap burner phone with a single number saved in it, and a rubber-banded stack of cash payment receipts. And that little black book was not the record of one desperate woman who stole one child. It was a page torn out of something much larger, and pulling on it was going to unravel a thing that had been running quietly in the dark for 20 years. I met Marion 2 days later. Prudence Hale and a family reunification specialist tried to prepare us both, tried to compress a month of careful expectation setting into a single afternoon, because Marion could not wait, would not wait, had already driven the 900 miles the same night she got the call and had been sitting in a hotel refreshing her phone, and because, it turned out, I could not wait either. They brought her into a soft-lit room at a family services building, and I stood up when the door opened and she came in, and the two of us just stopped and looked at each other across the carpet. She was older than the woman in the 13-year-old photograph. Of course she was. 13 years older, with lines around her eyes and mouth that I understood were the lines the searching had cut into her, and her hair was that light reddish brown. My hair, my real hair, the exact color that grew in at my roots, and she put one hand flat over her mouth and made a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life, a sound with 13 years pressed inside it. I did not remember her. I have to say that plainly because every movie about this moment lies about it. They all show the memories come flooding back the instant the mother appears, and they did not. They do not. That is not how it works. I looked at my own mother and felt like I was meeting a kind stranger, and that was its own specific grief, a grief that belonged to both of us and that that we would spend a long time carrying. But then she said my name. She said Julian, soft, broken, barely a whisper, and something underneath the not remembering, something older than memory, recognized the exact shape and pitch of that voice, because it was the voice from the yellow kitchen, the same voice that had sung over the apple slices. And I crossed the room and let this stranger who was my mother put her arms around me, and we stood there in the middle of that room, and 13 years came pouring out of both of us onto the floor, and neither of us tried to stop it. She told me a long time afterward that the hardest part of all those years, the very hardest, had been the birthdays, because on every single one she never knew whether I was somewhere alive to be having one. I had a family I had never known, Marion, my mother, who had refused to let me go, a father named Errol, who had been married to Marion when I was taken, and whom the loss had slowly, quietly torn away from her, the way that kind of loss so often tears the parents apart instead of binding them, so that by the time I was found, they had been divorced for years. Though Errol came within the week and sat across from me and cried the careful, choked way that large, quiet men cry when they've spent a decade not allowing themselves to. And a little sister I had never met and never known existed, because Marion had been pregnant with her on the very day I was taken, so that this girl had grown up her whole 13 years of life in the shadow of a brother who was a face on the wall and a name in her mother's nightly prayers and an empty seat at every holiday, a girl named Wynne, who was now the same age I had been when I first started keeping my list of wrong things. Wynne was wary of me at first, this actual living, breathing brother who had stepped down out of the story she'd been raised inside, and I understood her wariness completely, because I felt it too from the other side. But she had my exact reddish hair, and she had my exact habit of going still and quiet when a feeling got too big, and within a month, it was Wynne, more than anyone, who made the whole impossible thing survivable, because she was the only person in my new life who treated me like an ordinary, annoying older brother instead of a miracle or a tragedy or a case file, and I needed, more than I needed anything, for one single person in the world to treat me like an ordinary thing. My first weeks living in what everyone kept calling the real world were a kind of overload that I did not have words for yet. I moved into Marion's house, and it took me days to understand that it was the same house I'd been taken from as a toddler, the house with the grocery store still standing 4 blocks away, and that my bedroom in it had been kept first as a nursery and then, over the long years, slowly and painfully redecorated into a room for a boy Marion never stopped believing would someday come home to sleep in it. There were things everywhere in that house that were supposed to be mine, and that felt entirely like a stranger's, a stranger who happened to share my face. My legal name was Julian again, and I flinched every single time somebody used it, because for 13 years my whole nervous system had been trained to answer to Rook, to turn my head at Rook, and now Rook was a crime scene and Julian was a person I did not know how to be yet. I did not even know my own birthday. I had been celebrating a birthday in October my entire life, blowing out candles on a lie, and it turned out I had actually been born in March, which meant I had been a full different age than I thought I was, a different season, a different everything, that even the number of years I'd been alive had been quietly wrong. Small things wrecked me completely in those weeks, small things nobody could have predicted. Finding my own baby photographs, which existed, which had of course always existed, which had never for 1 second burned in any fire, was almost more than I could stand, because there I was, a documented 1-year-old and 2-year-old, chubby and laughing, standing in that yellow kitchen, a whole real recorded childhood that Lorna had looked me in the eye and told me was ashes. There had been no fire. There had never been a fire. The fire was simply the wall she had built, so that I would never in my life ask to see the photographs that would have shown me the truth in a single glance. Marion set me up with a therapist right away, a steady, soft-spoken man named Marlo Reeve, who worked specifically with children and teenagers who had come out of abductions and captivity. And in our very first session, I told him that I felt guilty, and he asked me why, and I told him the thing I had not been able to say to anyone else. I said I felt guilty because I loved Lorna, because the woman who stole me was the only mother I could remember having, and I missed her, physically missed her, missed the smell of the house and the sound of her checking the locks, and I hated myself for missing her. And how, I asked him, how do you sit across a table from your real mother, who spent 13 years refusing to give up on you, and carry inside you the fact that you are grieving the person who took you from her? Marlo did not look shocked. He did not flinch. He told me that what I was feeling was one of the most ordinary and expected things a person in my exact situation could feel, that a child bonds to whoever raises them, whoever feeds them and comforts them, and stands between them and the dark, and that Lorna had been the entire sky over my life for 13 years, and that missing her did not make me disloyal to Marion. It made me a human being who had been placed in an impossible position by an adult who did a monstrous thing to a child. He said we would untangle it slowly, that we did not have to solve it in a day or a month. He said it plainly, that this would take years and not weeks, that healing does not move in a straight line, that I was going to have days where I finally felt like Julian, and days where I felt like Rook wearing a Julian costume in a stranger's house, and that both of those kinds of days were part of the same long road home, and and that neither one meant I was failing. Detective Frost came to Marion's house about a week after the reunion, and he brought the FBI agent from the first night with him, a sharp, quiet woman named Nessa Pohl, and the two of them sat down at Marion's kitchen table with a folder thicker than the first one, and Frost said there was something I needed to hear, and that Marion needed to hear it too, and that it was going to be hard. He said the little black ledger from Lorna's metal box had cracked open a case that none of them had seen coming. Lorna, he explained, had not simply snatched a child off an impulse, had not one afternoon lost her mind and grabbed a toddler out of a shopping cart. The receipts in the burner phone tied her to a woman named Vesta Coyle, and for more than 20 years Vesta Coyle had run what looked on the surface like a small private adoption facilitation service, a quiet little business that helped desperate couples get a baby fast and clean and quiet, without the years of waiting and the mountains of paperwork and the home studies and the interviews that legal adoption demanded. She advertised nothing. She worked entirely by word of mouth, passed hand to hand between couples who had money and no patience and no questions, and underneath that respectable surface, she ran a supply chain for stolen and coerced children. Frost laid it out slow. Some of the children Vesta Coyle placed came from mothers she had pressured into surrendering during the worst moments of their lives. Young women, homeless women, women in the middle of an addiction or an eviction or a beating, women with no lawyer and no money and no one, whom Coyle's people found in shelters and clinics and hospital parking lots and moved on quickly, sliding papers in front of them that they did not fully understand and could not afford to fight. And some of the children, the ones the paying couples wanted the most and paid the very most for, came from people like Lorna, women who would take a toddler young enough to still forget, young enough that the memories would blur and sink, and deliver that child clean with a forged birth certificate and the recycled social security number of some infant who had died years before in another state, so that the child arrived on the buyer's doorstep already erased, already reborn, paperwork ready, traceable to no one, a blank new person for a family to name. Couples paid Vesta Coyle between $40,000 and $80,000 for a clean, papered child, Frost said, and he watched my face while he said it, and he watched Marion's. And then he said the ledger listed dozens of transactions, dozens, going back more than 20 years, dozens of children. He said it very carefully and very slowly because he needed me to understand it, needed both of us to understand it, that I was not the only one, that there were maybe 40 other people somewhere out in the country right now living inside a stolen life without any idea that it was stolen, some of them still children, some of them grown adults with jobs and kids of their own, and that some of them would be found because of Lorna's box, and some of them, the ones from long ago, the ones whose trails had gone cold, might never be found at all. I asked the question I had to ask, the one that had been sitting in my chest since the metal box. I asked whether Lorna had bought me or been paid for me. Frost hesitated, and I could see him decide to give me the truth because I had asked for it plainly and I deserved it. He said Lorna had been a supplier. She had been paid. There was a receipt in that box for a child delivered 13 years ago, a healthy boy, and the amount was written next to it in Lorna's careful hand, and the child was me. I had a price. I had been a line item in a book, a single entry between two other entries, a transaction. Marion made a sound and left the room, and I heard her in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, and I sat at that table and understood a new and specific kind of cold, the cold of learning that you were not just taken, you were sold, that a number had been written next to your body, and that the woman who raised you and dyed your hair and sang you to sleep had, at the very beginning, before any of the love, done it for money. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the room that had been kept for me for 13 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I turned the number over and over in my head, and I understood that this was going to be one of the things Marlowe and I would be untangling for years. The investigation moved fast after that, because the ledger was a map, and Frost and Agent Pohl and the whole federal team started walking it in every direction at once. They pulled the burner phone apart and traced the single saved number, and it led to a second phone and then to a name, and they started identifying the other families, couples across at least 4 states who had gone to Vesta Coyle over the years, and they had to begin the slow, careful, terrible work of sorting the coerced placements from the stolen ones, and figuring out how you go about telling a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old or a grown woman with 2 kids of her own that the people who raised her are not who they said they were, and that somewhere out there another family filed a police report about her a long time ago and never stopped grieving. Frost told me, more than once, that my case was the one that cracked it all open, because I was the first stolen child recovered while the operation was still running, still active, still taking orders, and that my forged documents and Lorna's ledger together handed them exactly the physical evidence they needed to move on Vesta Coyle before she could smell the smoke and burn everything and vanish. They found the forger next. The fake birth certificates that had papered every stolen child in that ledger for 2 decades had all been made by the same hand, and the hand belonged to a nervous, sweating, soft little man named Ambrose Teal, who had spent his career as a legitimate print shop owner and his nights making flawless counterfeit vital records for Vesta Coyle at a few $1,000s apiece. When the FBI knocked on Ambrose Teal's Teal's door at 6 in the morning, he did not last 5 minutes. Agent Pohl told me later that he practically pulled them inside, that he had been waiting 20 years for that knock and was almost relieved when it finally came, and that he sat down at his own kitchen table and started talking and did not stop for 2 days. He gave them the whole structure of it, the entire architecture, names and dates, and how the money moved and where the master records were kept and who protected the operation from the inside. And it was that last part, who protected it from the inside, that opened up the second thread none of us had seen. Because a forged birth certificate, no matter how perfect the paper and the seal, is only a piece of paper until a real government office accepts it as real and enters it into the actual system. And for 20 years, someone inside the county vital records office had been doing exactly that. His name was Dorsey Flint, and he was a mid-level supervisor at a county records division, a man with an ordinary desk and an ordinary tie and a mortgage and a boat. And for 2 decades, Vesta Coyle had paid him a quiet cut on every single placement to take Ambrose Teal's counterfeits and quietly enter them into the real record system, to backstop the fakes with genuine government confirmation, so that when a school or a doctor or a passport office ever checked, the stolen child's false identity came back valid, confirmed, real. Dorsey Flint was the reason the whole thing worked. He was the seam where the lie became the truth. When the FBI came for him, he tried at first to act baffled, tried to play the confused public servant, but they had Ambrose Teal's testimony and they had the money trail. 20 years of small deposits that did not match his salary, the boat, a lake cabin, a daughter's tuition, and the arithmetic of it was undeniable. And eventually he stopped pretending and started negotiating. Frost said it made him sicker than almost anything else in the case. Sicker than Lorna even, because Lorna at least had been swallowed whole by a delusion that she loved me. But Dorsey Flint had felt nothing, had simply typed stolen children into the system for a cut, one keystroke at a time, boat payment by boat payment, for 20 years, and had gone home every night and slept fine. The clerk's name was Dorsey Flint, and Frost sat at Marion's kitchen table and walked me through his part of it, because I asked to understand exactly how a thing like this could stay hidden for 20 years. And the answer, it turned out, was Dorsey Flint. He had worked in a county records office 3 states away, a mild, forgettable man with a mild, forgettable desk, and for 2 decades, Vesta Coyle had funneled her forged birth certificates through his window, and he had stamped them real, entered them into the state system, made them permanent and searchable and true, so that a stolen 3-year-old could get a real social security number and a real school record and a real driver's license someday and never once trip an alarm, because on paper, the child had simply been born. He took a few $1,000s per certificate. Frost said the investigators found a spreadsheet on Flint's home computer where he had tracked his own payments like a man doing his taxes, boat payment by boat payment, a small pontoon boat he was proud of, and that he had processed the paperwork that turned Julian into Rook, and had gone home that same night and grilled dinner and slept fine, and had done it dozens of times over 20 years for dozens of children, one keystroke at a time. When the case started to break, Flint heard about it before the agents reached him, and he spent a frantic weekend feeding 2 decades of paper records into a shredder in his garage, not understanding that the entries were already permanent in the state database he himself had put them into, that the very thing he'd built to hide the children was now the map that would find every one of them. And when the agents came, he had shredder confetti still stuck to his shoes. He folded inside an hour. He gave up everything he had in exchange for a lighter sentence, the dates, the payments, the exact procedure, which certificates were which, and his cooperation was part of what let the FBI move so fast, because Flint could look at a name and tell them whether the child underneath it was born or bought or stolen. The financial side was its own long unraveling. Forensic accountants spent months following Vesta Coyle's money through a maze of shell companies and church-adjacent nonprofits and personal accounts under 3 names, and what they found was that she had moved millions of dollars over 20 years, presenting herself the whole time as a humble faith-based adoption facilitator who barely covered her costs, while she owned a lake house and a boat of her own and traveled and wanted for nothing, all of it paid for by desperate couples who thought they were paying for paperwork and a chance at a family, and were actually paying for the theft of another family's child. Frost told me the part that was hardest to sit with, which was the scale. The master accounting that came later out of Vesta Coyle's own records listed transactions going back more than 20 years, and when the agents finished cross-referencing the entries against missing child reports and coerced surrender complaints across 4 states, the count of children who had passed through her operation was more than 50. More than 50. Some had been infants surrendered by mothers Vesta cornered in crisis, girls with no money and no lawyer who signed away children they wanted to keep, and some, the ones the paying couples valued most and paid the most for, were like me, taken young enough to forget and delivered clean, papered, renamed, ready to become someone new, so that there were adults out there in their 20s and 30s right now, Frost said, living entire ordinary lives under names that were never theirs, who had no idea, who might never know, whose real families had grieved them for decades. He said mine was the case that cracked the whole thing open, because I was the first stolen child recovered while the operation was still running, so So my forged documents and Lorna's ledger and my living, furious biological mother gave them the one thing they'd never had before, a complete thread they could pull, and pulling it unraveled the entire 20-year sweater. The hardest work, Frost said, the work that would take the FBI years, was the notification. Because now they had a list, and behind every name on the list was a person who had to be told, and there is no good way to knock on a door and tell a 19-year-old that the parents who raised her bought her, or to tell a set of parents who searched for 2 decades that their child is alive and grown and living 4 states away under another name and does not remember them. Frost said he insisted on delivering as many of those notifications himself as he could, in person, because he had spent 22 years learning that news like this should never come over a phone from a stranger, and I believed him, because he had crouched down on a library curb and said "Hi, Julian" to me like the words themselves were fragile, and I understood that this man had spent his whole career carrying other people's worst and best days into their kitchens with his own 2 hands. A task force got built to handle the flood of it, victim specialists and reunification counselors and prosecutors across 4 states, and for a while my family's quiet house was one small node in an enormous machine of grief and repair that Vesta Coyle had made necessary and never once thought about, because to her we had all been line items, inventory, a business, and the business had a supplier problem the day my cheek swab came back. Vesta Coyle ran when she realized the ground was opening under her. Ambrose Teal's arrest was the smoke she smelled, and she moved fast, faster than they expected, emptying accounts and packing a car and driving for the southern border with a hard suitcase full of banded cash and 3 passports in 3 different names. But the federal team had already flagged her at every crossing, and Border Patrol pulled her out of a slow line of cars at a coastal checkpoint late on a Thursday night, and when they searched the trunk of her car, they found just under $200,000 in rubber-banded bills, the 3 passports, and a second ledger, a bigger one she had not been able to bring herself to destroy, and that second book turned out to be the master record for the entire 20-year operation. Every child, every buyer, every payment, every cut to Dorsey Flint, all of it in one place in her own handwriting, the single most complete piece of evidence in the whole case, sitting in the trunk of a car 90 feet from Mexico. Frost called the house to tell us she was in custody, and I was in the kitchen when the call came, and I watched Marion take the phone into the hallway, and I heard her, my mother, who almost never let me see her cry because she was trying so hard every day to be a steady, solid, safe thing for a son who'd never had one. I heard her slide down the wall and sob into her own hand with a relief 13 years deep, because the woman at the very top of the thing that took her child was locked in a cell and was not getting out. The confirmation swab came back 4 days after they took it, though everyone in the room already knew what it would say, and Prudence sat with me when the result was read out, parent-child, 99.9 and a string of 9s, and I remember thinking that it was strange to need a laboratory to tell me what the yellow kitchen had been telling me my whole life, and that a number could make official the thing I had already felt click straight in the library. Marion told me, in those first days, the shape of the 13 years I'd missed from her side, not all at once in pieces, the way Marlo would later teach me to receive hard things. She told me about the billboards, how for the first few years there had been a billboard on the highway with my toddler face on it and a number to call, and how she used to drive past it on purpose because seeing my face up there in public felt like keeping me alive. She told me about the interviews, the anniversaries, every 1 year and 5 year and 10-year mark, another reporter, another camera, another chance that somebody somewhere would recognize the age-progressed drawing. She told me she had submitted her DNA to the Missing Children's database 8 years ago, and then, on the advice of a support group for parents of the missing, retested with the Ancestry Service 2 years ago, one more small act of hope among thousands, and that the second test was the only reason the match ever existed, that if she had given up even a little, even once in 13 years, I would still be Rook. And she told me the thing that undid me most, which was that she had never moved. She still lived in the same house, 4 blocks from the grocery store where I was taken, and when a reporter had once asked her why she didn't move somewhere with fewer memories, she'd said she couldn't, because if he ever found his way back, he had to be able to find home, and 13 years later a boy with her hair under dark dye did exactly that. My first night in that house I couldn't sleep, and Marion couldn't either, and around 2 in the morning I came downstairs and found her at the kitchen table, and neither of us knew what to say, so she made tea, and while the water heated she hummed something without noticing she was doing it, an old soft tune, and it was the song. It was the song from the Yellow Kitchen, the one the woman with the light hair sang while she cut apple slices, and I must have made a sound because she stopped and looked at me, and I asked her barely what that song was, and she said it was one she used to sing to me as a baby every day, and I told her I remembered it, that I had remembered it my whole life, that Lorna had told me the kitchen was a movie, but I could always smell the apples, and Marion put both hands over her mouth, and we sat in that kitchen at 2 in the morning while a 13-year-old lie came apart between us over a song. Win was harder, and in the end, more important. She was 13, exactly the age I'd been keeping my list of wrong things, and she had grown up her whole life as the sister of a ghost, of a face on the wall and a name in the nightly prayers and an empty chair, her, and now the ghost was real and living in the room down the hall and eating the last of the cereal, and she didn't know whether to be overjoyed or furious that the brother she'd competed with her whole life for their mother's grief had turned out to be an actual annoying person. For the first few weeks, she barely spoke to me. Then one night I couldn't sleep and neither could she, and we ended up in the living room at the same bad hour, and she asked me, not gently, whether I even wanted to be here, whether I missed the woman who took me, and instead of lying, I told her the truth, that yes, part of me did, and that I hated that part, and that I didn't know how to be her brother yet, but I wanted to learn, and something in her let go. And after that, she was the one who made it survivable, because she treated me like an ordinary, irritating older brother instead of a miracle, and I have told her since that she saved my life that year, and she tells me to stop being dramatic, which is exactly what a sister is supposed to do. Errol came within the week. My father, he and Marion had been married when I was taken, and the loss had done to them what that kind of loss so often does, hollowed out the marriage from the inside until there was nothing left to hold, so that by the time I was found, they'd been divorced for years. Two people who couldn't be in the same room without standing in the crater of the same missing child. He was a big, quiet man, and he sat across from me in Marion's living room and cried the careful, strangled way that men like him cry when they've spent a decade forbidding themselves to hope, and he kept apologizing for what I couldn't understand at first, and then I did. He was apologizing for the 90 seconds, for the fact that Marion had been the one loading the car, and he'd been at work, and neither of them had done anything wrong at all, and both of them had spent 13 years unable to forgive themselves for a crime a stranger committed. It took Errol and me a long time to find each other, but he was the one who eventually taught me to drive later, and something got built in that empty parking lot that the words never managed, and I count the day I merged onto a real road with him white-knuckled in the passenger seat as the day I got a father. Meeting the other recovered kids happened slowly over the following months, as the FBI worked their way down the ledger and made notification after notification, and it turned into the strangest and most necessary family I have ever been part of. There was a girl named Odette, 19 years old, who had been taken as an infant, so young that she had no yellow kitchen, no fragment of a memory, no smell of apples, nothing at all from before, and who took the whole thing harder than any of the rest of us, because Odette had genuinely had a happy childhood. The couple who raised her had loved her, had given her music lessons and a good school and bedtime stories and every ordinary tender thing, and they had also, at the very beginning, paid Vesta Coyle $60,000 for her. And now Odette had to hold both of those truths at the same time, that she was loved and that she was bought, that the parents she adored were criminals who had a stolen baby handed to them and asked no questions, and she did not know what on earth to do with a love. That was real, and a crime that was also real. And she was so much further along in her anger than I was that at first it frightened me, and then it freed me, because Odette taught me, without ever trying to, that I was allowed to be furious at people I also loved. There was a boy named Sim, 15, quiet, watchful, who had been one of the coerced surrender babies, whose real mother had been 16 years old and living in a shelter when Vesta Coyle's people found her and moved her, gently and relentlessly, toward signing papers she barely read, and Sim carried a different weight than Odette and I did, the weight of a birth mother who had never wanted to give him up, and had been maneuvered out of him by professionals, and who was, when the FBI found her, 31 years old and had spent half her life believing she had freely chosen to abandon her son, when in truth she had been hunted and harvested. We started meeting, all of us, the recovered ones, in a group that Prudence Hale helped organize through a survivor support organization run by a woman named Renata Voss, who had herself been raised under a false identity and found the truth in her 30s, and who understood every single thing about us without our having to explain any of it. In that room, I did not have to explain why I grieved my kidnapper. I did not have to explain why the name on my new document still felt like a costume, why I flinched at it, why some mornings I woke up and for 3 seconds I was Rook again in a small dim house and then remembered and had to grieve it all over. Nobody in that room needed the explanation, because they were all living some version of the same impossible sentence, and there was a kind of oxygen in that, a kind of rest that I had never had anywhere else. Odette became something like a second sister to me, running parallel to Wynn, the two of them occupying different rooms of the same feeling, and it was Odette I called at night when the anger came, and it was Wynn I sat with in the daylight when I just needed to be an ordinary, irritating older brother, and between the two of them, I slowly began to have a life. The recovery itself was made out of 1,000 small, overwhelming things that no one warns you about. I had never used a smartphone, not really, because Lorna had kept me on an old prepaid brick, and the first time Wynn handed me hers and I saw the flood of light and motion and notification, my hands started to shake and I had to give it back. Grocery stores undid me completely for months. The fluorescent lights and the music and the beeping registers and the endless walls of choice, and I understand now why, because a grocery store parking lot is where my whole life was stolen, and the first time Marion took me into one, I made it as far as the second aisle before the panic came up my throat, and I had to walk out and stand in the lot breathing while she stood beside me, not touching me, just there, until it passed. Marlo gave me the grounding exercises, the 5 things you can see, the 4 things you can hear, and I used them in checkout lines and in the passenger seat of the car and lying awake at 3 in the morning when a nightmare put me back in the dim house with the closed blinds. I learned my own family the way you'd learn a new language, slowly and with a lot of mistakes. I learned that Errol, my biological father, was a careful gentleman who had spent 13 years quietly falling apart and rebuilding, and that he and Marion, though they could not stay married under the weight of what happened, had never once turned on each other, had held a strange broken respect between them the whole time, and that both of them wanted, more than anything, to give me the thing that had been taken, which was simply a family, ordinary and imperfect and real. I learned that Wynne played the cello and hated it and kept playing it anyway, and that she had grown up half haunted by me, by the empty chair, by a mother who checked her breathing at night for years out of a terror that lightning could strike twice, and that having me finally home was, for Wynne, both a joy and a strange loss, because for 13 years she had been an only child living with a ghost, and now the ghost was a real boy who ate the last of the cereal and left his shoes in the hall, and she had to grieve the private, only child life she'd had, even as she got the brother she'd prayed for, and the fact that she could tell me that, out loud, without either of us falling apart, was one of the first signs that we were going to make it. Marion set me up with a therapist in the first week, before I'd even fully unpacked, a man named Marlo Reeve, who worked only with children who had come out of abductions and captivity and long-term concealment, and in our very first session I told him the thing I was most ashamed of, which was that I missed Lorna. I said it looking at the floor. I said that the woman who stole me was the only mother I could actually remember, and that I loved her, and that I missed her voice and her 3 checks of the locks and even the smell of the dye on the towel, and that I hated myself for missing her, and how was I supposed to look at Marion and grieve the person who took me from her? Marlo didn't flinch and didn't correct me. He said that what I was describing was one of the most predictable and most human things a person in my situation could feel, that a small child bonds to whoever raises him, that for 13 years Lorna had been the entire sky over my head, the whole weather of my life, and that missing her did not make me disloyal to Marion. It made me a person who had been put in an impossible position by an adult who had done a monstrous thing. He said we would untangle the 2 feelings slowly, the love and the anger, that they could both be true at once and I did not have to choose between them yet, and that this would take years and not weeks, and that healing was not going to be a straight clean line but a switchback trail that doubled back on itself, and that I was going to have days where I felt fully like Julian and days where I felt like Rook wearing a Julian costume, and that both of those kinds of days were part of the same road. I saw him twice a week for a long time. The nightmares started about 2 weeks in. In them, the front door of Marion's house would open, and Lorna would be standing there, calm, holding the dye and the towel, telling me it was time to go, and no one in the house could see her but me, and I would wake up certain I was still hers, certain the reunion had been the dream, and the yellow kitchen was the lie, and I would have to lie in the dark and name things out loud to find my way back, the reddish hair growing out at my roots, the real birthday in March, the sound of Wynne breathing in the next room, my actual name, until my body believed where it was. Marlo taught me to do that on purpose, to name 5 things that proved I was where I was, and slowly the nightmares thinned out, though they never fully stopped. And even now, a closed set of blinds in a stranger's window can put a cold hand on the back of my neck. The sensory part surprised me the most, because I hadn't expected my body to have its own opinions. Lorna had kept our life small and dim and quiet, the blinds always down, and I had never once been inside a large busy store, and the first time Marion took me to a real supermarket to pick out things for my own room, the lights and the noise and the size of it came down on me like a wave. The fluorescent buzzing I could feel in my back teeth, the music over the speakers, the announcements, the carts, the sheer number of people moving in every direction with somewhere to be, and the aisles going up and up with 1,000 choices when I'd never in my life been allowed to choose anything. It all hit at once, and my breathing went short and fast, and the floor seemed to tilt. I sat down right there between a display of cereal and a cooler of juice, knees up, and couldn't answer when Marion crouched next to me. She didn't panic. She got down on the floor with me in the middle of the store and counted my breaths with me, in for 4 and hold for 4 and out for 4, the same thing Marlo had taught us both, and she stayed there as long as it took, and she never once looked embarrassed. And later in the car, she explained that after years of a small, dim life, my nervous system simply wasn't built for that much input yet, and that we would go slow and build it up a little at a time, and we did. A gas station one week and a small shop the next, until a busy place stopped being a wall I hit and became just a loud room I could leave when I needed to. Errol taught me to drive, which turned out to be the thing that healed something between us that words couldn't reach. He'd come up on weekends and take me out to the empty lot behind a closed department store where there was nothing to hit, and he was endlessly, almost unbearably patient, this big, quiet man who had lost his son and his marriage in the same year, and had spent a decade not allowing himself to hope. And he'd sit in the passenger seat and talk me through the pedals in a low, even voice. And somewhere in all those slow, careful loops around an empty lot, he stopped being a stranger who happened to be my father and started being seeing my father, and the day I finally merged onto an actual road without either of us saying anything about how big a thing it was, he reached over and squeezed my shoulder once, and that was all, and it was everything. My real birthday was in March. I had spent my whole life celebrating a day in October that Lorna had invented off the dead infant's paperwork, and it turned out I was several months older than I'd always believed. A different age, a different everything, and the first March birthday Marion made for me was almost impossible to sit through because it was the first one in 14 years that was actually mine, and because she had a photograph, which she'd kept, of my very first birthday, the real first one candle. That yellow kitchen behind me, my own baby face lit up over a cake, and there had never been a fire. There was never any fire. The fire was just the wall Lorna had built so that I would never ask to see the pictures that would have told me the truth in a single glance, and finding a whole documented childhood that I'd been told was ash was somehow harder than almost anything else because it meant the proof had existed the entire time, on other people's walls, in other people's drawers, and I just hadn't been allowed to be in the room with it. The family cut us off was another lie, and this one I got to watch collapse in person. Marion's parents were alive, both of them, my grandparents, and they had not cut anyone off. They had spent 13 years searching alongside her, my grandfather driving out to follow tips that never led anywhere, and my grandmother running the family end of the tip line for years, and when they came to meet me, my grandmother held my face in both her hands and cried, and told me she had never once taken my picture off the refrigerator, and I understood then that every single thing Lorna had told me to explain the shape of our life had been a brick in a wall, the fire, the family, the moving, the dye, the name, each one a small lie built to hold up the one enormous lie underneath, that I was hers. Prudence, the social worker from the first night, set up a group for the recovered kids, and it became one of the strangest and most necessary families I have ever had. We met every couple of weeks in a room at the Family Services building, and there was a relief in that room I couldn't get anywhere else, because everyone in it understood the exact specific insanity of learning at 15 or 16 or 19 that your name was a lie, and nobody in it needed me to explain why I grieved my kidnappers, and nobody thought "who are you now" was a simple question. Odette was 19 and had been taken as an infant, too young for even a fragment, no yellow kitchen, no dreams, nothing at all to reach back toward, and she took the whole thing harder than any of us in a way that took me a long time to understand, because she'd had a genuinely happy childhood with the couple who raised her, a real and loving one, and it had turned out that they had bought her, paid Vesta Coyle for a clean papered infant, and never asked the questions they should have asked. And now Odette had to hold love and horror in the same two hands and didn't know how, because the people she loved most in the world were also the reason her real mother had spent 19 years not knowing if she was alive. Odette was further down the road of the anger than I was, and she taught me, mostly by example, that the anger was allowed, that I didn't have to keep folding it up small to protect Lorna's memory. Sim was 15 and had come into the operation a different way, one of the coerced surrender babies, his real mother 16 and homeless and cornered by Vesta Coyle at a shelter and pressured into signing papers she couldn't read. And Sim's grief had a different shape than mine, less betrayal and more sorrow, because the people who raised him hadn't stolen him so much as bought him from a woman who never truly had a choice, and he was trying now to build some kind of bridge to a birth mother, who was herself a kind of victim. There was a girl named Neve who came a few months in, newly recovered, 17, still in the first stunned week of it where the ground hasn't stopped moving, and I watched Odette do for Neve exactly what Odette had done for me, sit with her and tell her the anger was allowed and the grief was allowed, and that you could miss the people who lied to you and it didn't make you weak, and I understood that this was how the room worked, that we passed it down, each of us further along reaching a hand back to the one who'd just fallen through the floor. Marlowe gave me an exercise once, near the end of that first year, of writing a letter to Lorna that I would never send. He said sometimes getting the feelings onto paper sorted them out, even when nobody ever read the words. My first try was pure fury, a list of every lie in every stolen year, the fire and the dye and the name and the yellow kitchen she'd called a movie, and I crumpled it up because he'd said the letter was supposed to help me and not just pour gasoline. The second try was harder and stranger, because I tried to hold both things at once, that she had genuinely, in her broken way, loved me, kept me warm and fed and safe inside the small, dim prison she'd built out of another woman's life, and that the walls being soft did not make them anything other than walls, and that a person can love you and steal you in the same breath, and that the love does not undo the theft or earn her a single day back. I didn't send it. I might never. But writing that I could feel both things at once, that I could grieve her and be glad she was in a cell, was one of the first signs that the two feelings had finally stopped tearing me in half and started living side by side, which Marlowe said was not the same as forgiveness, and did not have to become forgiveness, and was its own kind of healing regardless. My hair grew out that year, the dye finally gone, the reddish-brown coming in at the roots and then all the way down, my real color, Marion's color, Wynn's color, and the first time I saw my own actual head in a mirror, without the dark over it, I stood there for a long time, because it was a small thing and it was also the last last piece of the disguise falling off, and the boy looking back at me finally matched the baby in the yellow kitchen. Being able to look at that boy in the mirror and know his name and know it was true and not fall apart was one of the first real signs that we were going to make it. The trials, when they finally came in 2 parts and took the better part of a year to arrive. Lorna and Hollis were charged by the state with kidnapping, false imprisonment, custodial interference, and multiple counts of identity fraud, 1 count for every forged document they had used to hold me over the years. Vesta Coyle, Ambrose Teal, and Dorsey Flint were charged federally, along with the rest of the operations corps, with conspiracy, child trafficking, identity document fraud, money laundering, and a string of other counts that took the prosecutor 20 minutes to read into the record, and the federal case against them was enormous, because the master ledger from the trunk of Coyle's car implicated every single one of them in every single transaction. The prosecutor handling the state case, my case, Lorna's case, was a plain-spoken, deliberate man named Barnaby Stott, who came to Marion's house more than once and sat with me and never talked down to me and never rushed me, and who explained the whole machinery of a trial in language I could actually hold, and who asked me gently near the end of the first visit whether I would be willing to take the stand and testify. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I said yes because I had spent 16 years being told to smile and say I was shy and go find my mother, 16 years trained to make myself unfindable and unspeakable, and I wanted with everything in me to sit in a room full of strangers and a judge and a jury and say out loud, in my own voice, in my real name, what had been done to me and to Marion and to the 3-year-old boy from the yellow kitchen who never got a say in any of it. Marlowe spent weeks helping me get ready, because testifying meant sitting 15 feet from Lorna for the first time since the night on the curb, and neither of us knew what my body would do when I saw her, and we practiced it, the way she had once practiced deflections with me, except now I was practicing the truth. Lorna's defense attorney was a polished, careful woman named Corliss Yardley, and she built Lorna's entire defense on a single terrible idea, which was that Lorna had come, over 13 years, to genuinely and completely love me, that whatever the circumstances of how I first came into her hands, she had raised me safely and gently and well, had never harmed me, had fed and clothed and educated and cherished me, and that a mother's love, even a stolen and criminal mother's love, was a mitigating thing that the court should weigh. I sat in that courtroom on the first day and listened to a lawyer in a gray suit describe my abduction as, in the end, an act of love, and I understood something I had not fully understood before, which is that a thing can be entirely true and entirely monstrous at the same time, and that the truth of it does not soften the monstrousness even slightly. Lorna probably had loved me. I believe to this day that in her broken, lockdown way she did. And it did not matter. It did not matter at all, because love is not a permission slip to erase a child, to sell a child, to steal 13 years of a mother's life and a boy's real name and call it protection. Marlowe spent weeks preparing me to testify, because taking the stand meant sitting a few feet from Lorna for the first time since the night the door of the only home I'd known came apart, and neither of us knew what my body would do when I saw her again. We practiced it over and over in his quiet office, him playing the defense attorney, asking the hard, soft questions, watching to see when my breathing climbed and my hands started to go, teaching me to plant my feet on the floor and name the wood grain of the witness rail if the room started to tilt, teaching me that I could ask for a break, that I could take a breath before an answer, that the truth did not have to be rushed. Barnaby Stott prepared me on the other side of it, walking me through how a courtroom worked, what he would ask and in what order, what Corliss Yardley might try, and he told me the one thing that steadied me most, which was that my only job on that stand was to tell the truth, and that the truth was already on my side, that I did not have to perform or convince or win, I only had to say what happened, and the saying of it was enough. The morning of my testimony, Marion sat in the front row where I could find her face, and Wynne beside her, and Errol beside Wynne, and Frost was there too, in the back, in a suit, on his own time, and I walked to the stand with my legs not entirely under my own control, and I found Marion's eyes and I planted my feet and I began. When I took the stand, Barnaby Stott walked me through it slowly and kindly, and I told the whole thing. The 11 towns, the closed blinds, the fire that never happened, the dark dye over the reddish brown, the drills about being shy, the last name we changed overnight, the driver's permit, and the fear that drained the color from Lorna's face, the yellow kitchen I had remembered my entire life and been told 100 times was a movie. I told the jury what it is to learn at 16 that your own name is not your name. I looked at Lorna exactly once while I spoke, near the end, and she was crying without any sound, tears just running down a face I had loved my whole life, and she mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," across that courtroom to me, and I made myself look away, because her sorry had arrived 13 years and one federal task force too late, and because I had learned, slowly, in that room with Renata Voss, that I was allowed to. Corliss Yardley cross-examined me, and she was gentle about it, which was its own kind of cruel, and she tried to lead me towards saying that I'd had a happy childhood, that Lorna had been kind to me, that I had been loved, and I did not lie, because the whole thing is worth nothing if I lie. And so I said yes. Some days I had been happy, and I said that this was the very cruelest part of all of it, that Lorna had built me a small, warm, happy prison out of a life she had stolen from another woman, and that the walls being soft, the walls being warm, the walls being made of bedtime stories and dyed hair and a mother's careful love did not make them any less walls, and did not give back the 13 years, and did not unsell the boy in the ledger. When Corliss Yardley finished, Barnaby Stott stood for redirect, and instead of asking me more questions, he asked the court's permission to walk the jury through the contents of the metal box, the locked box that had lived under Lorna's bed for 13 years, 4 feet beneath where she slept, and one at a time, he laid its contents out on the evidence table where the jury could see them. The forged birth certificate for a boy named Rook, with a birth date in October that was invented, and a hospital that had no record of any such birth. The social security card that had belonged to a real infant, a boy who had died at 11 weeks old decades earlier in another state, whose small dead identity Lorna and Dorsey Flint had reached into a database and pulled up and stapled onto a living stolen child. And then last, the newspaper clipping. It had been folded and unfolded so many times over 13 years that it was soft as cloth at the creases and beginning to separate. A short article about a 3-year-old boy named Julian, taken from a grocery store parking lot in 90 seconds in broad daylight, and Barnaby Stott held it up and let the jury look at it and asked them to consider one thing, which was that a confused woman, a woman who had somehow convinced herself she'd done nothing wrong, does not keep this. You keep this, he said, only if you always knew. You keep this, and you carry it through 11 towns, and you lock it under your bed, and you take it out and read it and fold it back up. Only if the truth of what you did is a thing you looked at, on purpose, again and again for 13 years, and chose every single time to keep hidden. He showed them photographs after that, the windows of our houses with the blinds always drawn in the middle of the day, the boxes of dark dye lined up under a bathroom sink, a childhood's worth of empty spaces where a school record or a vaccination card or a single photograph should have been, and with each image the room got quieter and colder, and I understood that Barnaby Stott was building the same wall in reverse, taking Lorna's careful bricks and stacking them back up in front of the jury, so they could see the shape of the thing she'd built. Hollis sat through all of it at his own table, separate from Lorna's, and he looked like a man who had finally set down something he'd carried so long his hands had grown around it. He had cooperated from nearly the first day, given the investigators everything he knew, and his own lawyer's argument was not that he was innocent, but that he had been the lesser hand, the one who drove and packed and kept his head down and his mouth shut and knew, always knew, and did nothing, and let it happen for 13 years because he was afraid, and Barnaby Stott did not dispute that framing so much as insist that fear is not the same as innocence, that a child was disappeared in front of this man for over a decade, and his silence was one of the walls of the prison too. Hollis never once looked at Lorna during the trial. He looked at me, though, several times, and there was something in his face I have never fully sorted out. Not quite an apology, more like a man looking at the daylight for the first time in years and not knowing if he's allowed to. Marion testified after me, and I could barely stand to watch it. My mother on the stand describing the grocery store parking lot, the 90 seconds, turning back around to a shopping cart with an empty child seat, the years of billboards, the interviews on every anniversary, the DNA she mailed off, the refusal to move out of the house because she needed to be findable, the birthdays she never knew if I was alive to have. And when Barnaby Stott asked her at the end what she wanted the court to understand, Marion turned and looked directly at Lorna across the room and said in a voice that did not shake, "She did not just take my son. She took his childhood, and she took my daughter's brother, and she took every ordinary day the 4 of us should have had, all 13 years of them, and she sold him like a thing, and she kept the newspaper story about it in a box under her bed the whole time, and she almost got away with it forever." The jury was out less than a day. Guilty on every count for Lorna. Guilty on the counts he faced for Hollis, though the jury plainly understood he had been the lesser and more cowardly hand, a man who chose his own skin over a child's whole life for 13 years, but who had not been the one to reach into the cart. When the verdicts were read, Lorna finally broke down completely, folded over the table sobbing, and Marion took my hand and held it so hard it hurt, and Wynne on my other side was crying, and Errol behind me made a low, broken sound, and what I felt was not triumph, it was not victory, it was a vast, exhausted quiet, the exact feeling of a crooked house that has stood wrong for 16 years, finally being pulled all the way down to the ground so that something true can be built where it stood. The federal trial for Vesta Coyle and Ambrose Teal and Dorsey Flint came a few weeks later, and it was a bigger, colder, more overwhelming thing, run by a federal prosecutor named Sable Ridgway, who moved through the evidence like a surgeon. It was a parade of forensic accountants tracing 2 decades of money through shell accounts, and document examiners walking the jury through the exact ways Ambrose Teal's counterfeit certificates matched the ones in the county system that Dorsey Flint had validated, and Teal himself testifying against Coyle in exchange for a reduced sentence, small and sweating, and finally, 20 years too late, telling the truth. Recovered children took the stand one after another to put living faces on the ledger's entries, and Odette testified, 19 years old in a courtroom full of strangers, and she was magnificent and furious and clear, and she said the thing none of the rest of us had found the words for, that a person is not a product, that a childhood is not a service you can purchase, that the couples who paid and asked no questions were not customers, they were part of the machine, and that the machine had a name and it was sitting right there at the defense table. Dorsey Flint's own attorney tried to paint him as a small cog, a paper pusher who just processed forms and didn't know where the children came from, and Sable Ridgway destroyed that in an afternoon, because the master ledger showed a payment to Dorsey Flint next to every single stolen child, which meant he had always known there was something to be paid for hiding, and the jury's faces while they understood that were something I will not forget. Sim testified after Odette, 15 years old and steadier than any of us expected, and his testimony did something to the room that the money and the documents couldn't, because Sim wasn't a stolen child, Sim was a bought one, and Sable Ridgway brought his birth mother into it carefully, the woman who at 16 had been homeless and cornered at a shelter and pressured by Vesta Coyle into signing papers she couldn't fully read, and when Sim described meeting that mother for the first time at 17 years of distance, describing a woman who had never wanted to give him up and had been made to feel she had no choice, you could see the jury understand that Vesta Coyle's cruelty ran in two directions at once, that she had preyed on the desperate to supply the wealthy, and that there was no clean edge anywhere in what she had built. The forensic accountant who took the stand next was a quiet, methodical woman who walked the jury through 20 years of money with a patience that made the horror worse, not better, and she put two columns up where the jury could see them both, and on one side were the things Vesta Coyle had bought for herself, the lake house and the boat and the travel and the accounts under 3 names, and on the other side were the things the families had done to pay her, the mortgages taken out, the retirement savings emptied, the second jobs, all of it handed over by people who believed they were paying for paperwork and a chance at a family, and the accountant said flatly that by the master ledger's own numbers, Vesta Coyle had personally taken in more than $4 million, and that not $1 of it had ever gone toward the welfare of a single child. A man named Alden, an adult recovered survivor in his 30s, testified about being one of Vesta Coyle's earliest deliveries, taken as a toddler more than 3 decades ago, and only found now because the ledger reached back that far, and he described the specific grief of learning the truth as a grown man with children of his own, of having to look at his own kids and understand that half of their family history was a fiction, that the grandparents in the stories he'd told them had bought. Their father and his testimony was the one that made me understand what Frost had meant about the dozens still out there who might never know, because for 30 years this man had simply been a happy person with no idea he was a crime, and Vesta Coyle had counted on exactly that, had built her whole operation on the arithmetic that a child taken young enough would never testify, and here he was testifying anyway, 30 years late, because one boy on the edge of a soccer field had swabbed his cheek. The defense had almost nothing left to do by then but object, and Vesta Coyle's attorney made the argument that she had genuinely believed she was placing children in loving homes, that she saw herself as a facilitator of families and not a thief of them, and Sable Ridgway answered that in her closing by holding up the newspaper clipping Lorna had kept, the one about a missing 3-year-old named Julian, and reminding the jury that a facilitator of families does not need to keep a trophy of a mother's worst day locked in a box, that everyone in this machine, the supplier and the forger and the clerk and the broker at the top, had known precisely what a stolen child was and had chosen the money anyway, over and over, for 20 years. They asked me if I wanted to testify at the federal trial too, as I had at the state one, and Sable Ridgway told me honestly that she didn't need me, that between Odette and Sim and the older survivors and the mountain of financial evidence the case was already crushing, and that I had already given the case its foundation just by existing, by being the recovered child whose thread unraveled all the rest, and so I sat in the gallery instead, next to Marion and Wynne, and watched other people carry the weight for once, and there was a kind of healing in that too, in not having to be the one on the stand, in being allowed to simply be a boy sitting between his mother and his sister watching justice arrive. Vesta Coyle herself never showed a flicker of anything. She had run a business selling children for 20 years, and she sat through all of it, through Odette's testimony, through the accountants, through the photographs of the recovered kids, with the mild, patient expression of a woman waiting for a bus, and I think that blankness, more than any single piece of evidence, was what turned the jury to stone. The financial case alone was overwhelming. Millions of dollars moved through accounts over 20 years, and stacked on top of the 2 ledgers and Teal's testimony and Flint's payment trail and the recovered children themselves, it was airtight. And the jury found Vesta Coyle guilty on every count, and found Ambrose Teal guilty on the counts his deal had left him, and found Dorsey Flint guilty of everything the government charged. At sentencing, the state judge looked at Lorna for a long moment before she spoke, and then she gave her 30 years. And in doing so, she named the thing that made it 30 and not less, which was the folded newspaper clipping in the metal box. The 13 years of complete and deliberate knowledge, the fact that Lorna had never once in all that time been confused about what she had done, had kept the proof of the crime under her own bed and dyed the evidence's hair every 3 weeks, and looked the boy she stole in the eye and told him his real memories were a cartoon. Hollis received 12 years for 13 years of choosing to hide me. The federal judge gave Vesta Coyle 40 years and ordered every asset she had ever touched seized and turned toward restitution for the families she had torn apart, and gave Dorsey Flint 18 years and had some particular words for a public servant who typed stolen children into the system of record for the price of a boat, and gave Ambrose Teal the reduced term his cooperation had bought. And when it was all read into the record, the operation that had run in the dark for 20 years was finished, dissolved, every thread of it in a cell. The gallery at the federal sentencing was full of people I had come to know that year and people I had never met. And when the 40 years came down for Vesta Coyle, the room did not erupt the way courtrooms do in movies. It went the other way. It went silent and heavy, because for most of the people in those benches, this was not a victory so much as the closing of a wound that would leave a scar for the rest of their lives. Odette was there, and Sim, and Alden with his grown children, and Renata Voss, who ran the Survivor Support Organization and had herself been raised by people who bought her decades before any of this, and who told me afterward that she had waited her entire adult life to watch a person like Vesta Coyle let out of a room in cuffs. The restitution the judge ordered would never make anyone whole. Everyone understood that. You cannot buy back 13 years or 30, but the seizing of every account and the lake house and the boat meant something anyway, because it took the profit out of it. It made the arithmetic that had run the whole thing for 20 years finally come out negative, and that mattered. The case had become national news by the sentencing, the way these things do. A broker who sold stolen children for 20 years, and the boy who cracked it open with a cheek swab, and the story ran everywhere for a while. And the strangest and most important thing it did was reach the other families. Because the ledger was long, and the notifications took years. And every few weeks that whole first year there would be another one somewhere in the country, another door, another detective crouching down, another person in their 20s or 30s learning that their name was not their name, and some of those reunions were joyful, and some of them broke families in half, and all of them existed only because a thread had finally been pulled. Renata Voss's organization was overwhelmed with new members that year, people who had just fallen through the same floor I'd fallen through, and I started going to more meetings, and then helping run some of them, because I understood by then that this was how the room worked, that the ones a little further down the road reached a hand back to the ones who had just landed, and I had a hand to reach back now, and reaching it was the first thing in my whole life that felt like a purpose instead of a hiding place. Some of the stolen were never found. Frost was honest with me about that the ledger held names they could not attach to any living person, children who had vanished so completely into invented lives that there was no thread left to pull, and that some of them would go their whole lives never knowing, and that this was the part of the job that would follow him into retirement. But dozens were found. Dozens of families that had grieved for decades got a phone call because of a soccer field and a swab, and I have had to learn to hold that too. The enormity of it, the fact that the smallest, most ordinary decision I ever made, a friend's dumb idea in a bathroom, turned out to be the thing that reached back through 20 years and pulled a whole hidden world into the light. Barnaby Stott found me in the courthouse hallway after Lorna's sentencing, and he shook my hand, and he told me something I have carried ever since. He told me that my cheek swab, that one DNA kit I had very nearly not done, that game I did in a friend's bathroom against every instinct Lorna had trained into me, had ended an operation that had been stealing and selling children for 2 decades, and would have simply kept going, kept taking toddlers out of carts and babies out of shelters, and that because a 16-year-old on the edge of a soccer field decided that he wanted, just once, to know one true thing about himself. Dozens of families were going to get answers they had stopped believing they would ever get. On the courthouse steps afterward, in the cold, clean air, my mother put her arm around me. My real mother, Marion, whose light reddish-brown hair was my hair, the color that had grown all the way back in now that no one was dyeing it dark, and on my other side stood my sister Wynne with that same hair and that same way of going quiet, and somewhere behind us, Errol and Odette and Renata were coming down the steps, and someone from the family services office at the bottom of the stairs lifted a hand and called out to us, called out to me, and the name they called was the soft, 2-syllable name from the Yellow Kitchen, the name I had heard in my dreams for 16 years before I ever knew it was mine, and I turned toward the sound of it without thinking, without hesitating, without any part of me still trained to flinch, because it was mine. It had always been mine. It had been mine the entire time under the dye and the fire and the fake last name and the closed blinds, and I answered to it the way you answer to something you have been waiting your whole life to hear. Julian. That was my name. I was Julian, and I was home.